So good evening, coaches. Welcome to another learning engagement brought to you by the ICF Mumbai Chapter. My name is Anuradha Sant, and I'm your host for this evening. I'm an MCC coach through ICF, a life and executive coach, and a leadership OD and HR specialist with over 25 years of experience in leading MNCs. And it's my absolute pleasure to be here with you all today. My co-host for this evening is Abhilasha Jha. She's also a leadership and life coach, an ACC through ICF, experienced HR leader and entrepreneur, design thinking facilitator, and a visiting faculty with 19 years of work experience. As we're all ready to begin and settle in, I'd like to share a few housekeeping tips. I'll request all of you to go off video and preferably keep your mics on mute during the entire length of this webinar until we or the speaker asks you to open up and have any questions that you may want to share with the facilitator. This is largely done to avoid any disruption in the transmission or which could lead to some bandwidth issues. Also, during the session, we will have, if you have any burning question or if you have any comments, please feel free to put it down in the chat box. We will either prompt you to speak up or we will relay them to Rob so that he could answer them for you. I also request each one of you to write your full name as you wish it to appear in your CCEU certificate, and also your email ID in the chat box now. And also, I would request you to do the same a few minutes before the close of the session in order for us to avoid you the CCEU certificates. We will also be conducting a 4-question feedback poll at the end of the session, which will be very important for us to gather your inputs of. And it's really valuable for our program and programming team to keep bringing up more meaningful content for you. So I would request you at the end of the webinar, please stay back for a moment, give your inputs in the feedback poll because it's important for us to gather all your inputs there. As we're bidding, so this webinar is going to be for 1 hour, 30 minutes. So it's a total of 90 minutes. And as we're planning this webinar, Rob has said that's largely going to be a very, very interactive one. So feel free to interact and use the chat box as you please to make it as interactive as possible. Rob also said that he's not going to have slides put up, so it's going to be conversational, experiential, and an absolutely learning environment which he needs to create here. So today's webinar topic is liberation, calling and complexity, coaching new vectors of adult development. And during this webinar, the facilitator Rob will help you explore a new meta-psychological framework that will enable coaches to better operate within the intrinsics of the human psyche in all situations and contexts. This model will be used to clarify vectors of learning and development that can better your or your clients' challenges and opportunities. Current challenges troubling us or our clients in change efforts will be discussed using real examples, and we have about 3 of them which Rob has chosen to test the efficacy and utility of the model. In the process,
mute all the participants. Somebody's just mute all the participants as a co-host.
Sure. So as I was saying, in the process of this discovery, we will uncover some novel facets that can advance our ability to better serve in today's challenging times. Now with this, I'd like to formally welcome Rob McNamara, a facilitator and presenter for the day. So Rob is an author, advisor, consultant, and a leadership coach with an expertise in adult development and human performance. He's a co-founder of the advisory firm Delta Developmental and is the vice president of strategy and innovation in the World Com University Educational Initiative. Rob serves on faculty in the Ivy School of Business, Lift Advanced Coaching Program, and is a former Harvard University teaching fellow. Rob currently advises and coaches initiatives advancing national security efforts and provides learning, development, and educational direction for individuals, organizations, and governments navigating civilizational transitions. Rob is an integral Zen Dharma holder, training under Diane Moshe Hamilton Roshi. Rob's current area of focus join metapsychology, metapsychology, ethics, leadership development, and human performance. He's known to be a big heart, radical embodied presence, and purpose driven commitment to enacting new visions of the future of humanity. Wow, that's quite an achievement, Rob. Also, there's another fun fact about Rob. In college days, during exam week, he would wear a huge afro wig for the entire week. Why, we asked him, and he said he felt that the surface area of hair increased his ability to absorb knowledge and information, or that was his excuse for not studying or making the situation light. As a result, if you see Rob now, he is nearly bald. I don't know, is it perhaps that's caused because of his wearing the afro wig early in his days?
Yeah, it might be pain.
So now, as we, on this note, let's turn our attention to the man of the moment, Rob, Rob McNamara. So over to you, Rob. Floor is completely yours.
Thanks for the warm introduction, and thanks to everybody for joining us. It's an honor to be with all of you today. So thanks for joining your day and the end of your week. So just to lay out a little bit of my intention is to be pretty succinct and concise in terms of what I'm presenting to you, and then diving in right away to examples and how to put this into action, these concepts into motion with your clients and with yourself. So hopefully most of the time won't be me just talking at you, but it'll be us actually working together on stuff. So with that said, let's just dive in. So the three main pieces: liberation, calling, and complexity. And each of these has their own kind of developmental trajectory, or we could say maturational process, so that we can become more mature in our ability to liberate. And I'll speak a little bit about what that is later. Saying we can mature in ever more refined ways to become more in alignment with our calling or callings, and or we can call that purpose. And then lastly, complexity. Like we can mature in our ability to work with ever more complex things. And the first kind of proposition that I have for you is that, and I'm going to put this in the chat so those of you who want to kind of see it, but this first proposition says that development, calling, and liberation are intrinsics to the human psyche in all situations and in all contexts. And hopefully by the end, this will become readily evident. So complexity is always unfolding. You're always participating in some facet of your calling or your purpose, the reasons for your existence. And you're always ensconced in some movement towards your own liberation or freedom. And this gives us a diverse way to kind of move in very fluid and dynamic ways with our clients. And in the broadest sense, we can work more elegantly in a developmental way when we can include all three of these. So that's kind of the first proposition. Second proposition, I'll put it in the chat here so you can see it, is that at times, some directions are going to be more active than others, which means it'll be really evident. Like in this moment with your client, the most value creating movements that we can do in our coaching context is to really work with the liberation side of things, or if we don't clarify and brighten the courage to participate with our calling, like that's going to hinder our client's ability to move forward. So at any moment, some dimension is going to lean forward, and that can change over the course of a couple minutes of talking with somebody. And again, so you'll start to see how these are fluidly integrated. But that's our second proposition. And the third proposition is that underutilized facets will cost us both aliveness and effectiveness, meaning that if we spend too much time and energy investing in the complexity of our minds and our perspective taking and our sense making, we will inevitably lose aliveness and lose effectiveness, because we might ever get pulled out into taking more perspectives, networking more and more complex ideas together. And over time, we might actually have lost our roots, so to speak. You know, what are we really called to do? The mind has become so expansed and so broad that we're no longer tethered to really what our unique gifts are and what our callings are, just as an example. And likewise, if we spend too much time in liberation, we might not grow the skills that we need to navigate interpersonal relationships more effectively. So that's kind of our third proposition. And I offer these just as things to test and to see. So that's kind of the opening frame. And let me just pause and see, are there questions if things aren't clear about those three propositions? And I know I haven't gotten into complexity and liberation calling yet, but that's where I'm headed. But if there's foundational things that would help you, let's give a moment just for comments or questions. Okay, so I see explain the first proposition. Yeah. So just to unpack a little bit more, that we're a learning organism. So learning and development in the complexity sense is always happening, always. And we're always moving towards some greater freedom of choice. There's never a point in your life where like this movement towards freedom of choice isn't actually present. Likewise, the specificity, the uniqueness of you is always present. It never goes away. And there's always that pressure. And so that's what I mean by there's a simultaneity, that these are intrinsic to you. And they're always operating on you. They're always operating on your client at every point in your conversation and at every point in life. Does that, Shankar, does that help?
definitely help.
Okay, great. So does it mean all these have to be in balance? And that's a good question. Oh, thank you. So I mean, the question of balance is a good one. If we pull back and we look at our client life as a whole, we probably want to have some balance. But in any one given moment, we're not trying to find a balance in the moment. It appears that in any specific context, in any specific moment, liberation might be more called for. Complexity might be woven in there, and calling is obviously present, but the leading edge might be liberation or freedom. And vice versa. Like, oh, it's really clear if we don't develop this particular skill, they're just not gonna, our client is not gonna be successful in what they're trying to achieve. And so we really need to focus in on that as the leading edge. So from a macro perspective, if we pull back and look at all of life, it's probably wise that we do have some balance, but not in the particular moment. We actually want imbalances and asymmetries in the moment because it helps create momentum. So, I mean, is that useful? Or does that help?
Yeah, very useful. Thank you.
Perfect. Yeah. All right, so we'll talk more about liberation here. Yeah, I'll when we get there, we'll get there. So let's dive in. So complexity, or more properly, hierarchical complexity, is kind of the first piece that we're going to pick up. And you got a little bit of reading so that you can get a sense of how I'm using the term. And this is like when you think of development proper, we're talking about the assembly of more complex skills, more complex identities. But I'm going to shift our attention away from identity development, which is a big conversation of the self and how we evolve, and more hug the contours of skill development. So I find that for some of my clients, I can talk about identity development and stages of adult development, and they eat it up and it's incredibly powerful. But most of my clients are more open and more curious about skill development. And so just I offer that frame to you in terms of when you're working with people developmentally, the assembly or the synthesis of more complex skills, as you read about, is very accessible to almost all adults. At least that's been my experience. And so just to give you another example, one of the topics that came up in what was submitted is this notion of open communication. So if the goal is to create open communication, the developmental question that we want to ask ourselves is, what are the underlying prerequisites that allow open conversations to occur, right? And for us, our coaching gravitas is going to be most potentiated in our lived experience, what we know, or how we've experienced open conversation. So we can use our own kind of history and intelligence to start to kind of unpack this. And we can also go into our clients' world, their interior of when have you experienced open communication? What were the kind of things that were present? And we're trying to get a sense of what are the kind of basic things that need to be in place that then allow this more complex thing to occur, what we're calling open communication. And so just to give you an example, I was thinking in terms of open communication, it's really important that I cultivate or have some ability to extend interpersonal warmth and care. And so that would be like one thing that if I didn't do that, I probably wouldn't have an open conversation. Similarly, if I can't regulate myself in the face of difference, I'm probably not going to be very good in an open conversation. So Rob needs some ability to, take care of himself privately while different opinions or perspectives or challenging things might come up in an open perspective. And if I don't have that in place, I'm probably going to put limits on the conversations that I'm facilitating. So those are kind of two examples of like things that I need to be able to do either for myself or in relationship with a group that I'm trying to have an open conversation with. And then we can keep going. There's things like trust and validation. What are those building blocks of trust? And how do I both be validated and how do I validate others? And then discernments. Like I need to have discernments of what's actually not allowed in an open conversation. Like an open conversation probably isn't going to go very far if there's a bunch of accusations, blame, and criticism coming in. At least that'd be my recommendation for an open conversation. Like we can voice our grievances, but maybe we should be able to take ownership for our first person experience so that we don't go right into blaming. And that might foster more open conversation. And all this, it comes together in like an ability to set up ground rules. So if I can do all these things from interpersonal warmth and care, I can regulate myself, I can have a trustable container, and we can understand how to validate each other and support each other. And I'm really clear about what's not allowed and what is welcome in an open conversation. Now I can set some really good ground rules. Hey, let's be for each other. Can everybody agree to that? Okay, you can't? All right, that's a problem. If you're not actually for everybody here, like that's, we can't have an open conversation if you're against and not really for people here. Because if you're here to fight and you're here to kind of seek revenge, we're probably not going to get very far in terms of our open conversation. So being for each other, and another ground rule could be listening generously. Can we all agree that we're going to just listen with the generosity to really hear what people need to say or want to say? And then we might want to create some boundaries around confidentiality, for example. Like what leaves this open conversation? Is it completely contained and we're not going to bring it out there, or is it free to kind of share? And those are kind of things for us to decide as a group to increase kind of our levels of trust. And then things like, oh, okay, I really want people to feel supported here, but I also want enough challenge. So can we get some ground rules in place around support and challenge? So those are some things that I was thinking about with regards to hierarchical complexity. And my hope is that you can see that here's a challenge. How do I cultivate open conversations? Well, okay, what are your client really strong in that are supportive for open conversations, and what gaps are missing? Oh, you know what? Like you need to work on your self-regulation. That might be an example of like, okay, we need to work on your ability to listen and receive things that are that challenge you. And how do you regulate yourself? So let's go into, okay, stabilize your breathing and relax your jaw, very elemental basic things. If you can't relax your breathing, relax your face in the face of challenging things that are happening in your environment, the likelihood of your mind relaxing is probably not all that good, right? So we can work on basic things that build up into more complex skills. So that's the basic idea. Let's dive into an example, and let's see, Vivek, if you would come forward. You shared a great example that could be useful for us, and then we'll use this as a way to explicate further hierarchical complexity. And yeah,
Sure.
so
can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
So the example I shared right now, I'm not clear how it relates with hierarchical complexity, but let me share the challenge or situation I'm currently going through, right? So I'm coaching this gentleman who's head of finance, and the company has other subdivisions. So it's a big Indian company. And since he's the head of finance, one can imagine. So in India, the degree is called Chartered Accountant. We call CA. So around 28 years of experience in industry. This gentleman is very good with his work, knows numbers in detail, knows where is money from, where is money going. And when he does audits of different divisions, he pretty much knows which division is doing well and which division is not doing well. Right? He's very thorough. Whatever he's doing, actions are very good. And whatever analysis he's doing is good for the company. The feedback we got about this gentleman is whenever he talks with his colleagues, right? So he typically deals with presidents of those divisions. And whenever he talks to them, apparently they feel he's in the face. He's very direct when he tells them where is the gap or what they need to do. The presidents don't appreciate the way he communicates. And when I'm currently coaching him on to be more humane when he's talking to people, when the suggestions are given to them. He's quite new in the company, I think roughly around a year, but he has been out of other company where he had spent around 10 plus years. And the number of complaints from the presidents are so many. The HR president says we may need to, ask to go. But the plus point is he's very good in his job. And when we had initial chat or the agreement part, he says, I'm doing my job very well. I'm here to save money for the company. So what is this big deal about communication? I think people should put a filter, and they just should take my suggestions as objective suggestions and just go ahead and implement it. And he says, well, I'm listening to you as a coach and I'm taking this feedback, but I'm doing my job as a head of finance to tell them what's going well and what's not going well. And president should be mature enough to take my data as data, not as, don't apply the filters of my communication skills. That's where we are at.
Yeah, lovely example. Yeah. So thanks for sharing and being willing to share. I really appreciate it. And I'm just going to be brief because I want us to cover everything. So I just want to apologize in advance. But in this situation, we have a lot of complexity in terms of the financial management of funds, the organizational visibility in terms of how the org and how divisions are performing. So that's all great. And what I would propose, and one that is often highly effective, is to use kind of some of those strong suits to start to address things where he's not very developed. So to have really pristine kind of understanding of numbers, of patterns, of trends, of like that systemic view of the organization from a fiscal point of view, fantastic, right? But are you tracking, and this would be, instead of framing this as how can your communication become more humane, a better frame would be like, can we keep his mind thinking fiscally, because he's very complex there, but how do we get that to what's called shell over to this other domain of human communication, which is not all that complex, right? At least that's what I'm hearing. Like his interpersonal skills need some refinement or development or polishing. And so the frame that could be more useful is how I need you to track, how are you spending your political capital? Or we might say, how are you spending your interpersonal capital? Oh, like now we've got a nice frame. It's a familiar, like we're spending things. We need to track spending. And am I gaining political capital with this interpersonal exchange, or am I losing it? And that might be a way to get like right down into a curiosity for this person to start to engage the interpersonal domain in ways that gives people a better experience. So let me pause and see what happens for you when I say that, just that little reframe. And maybe you've already tried this, so.
So what I'm observing is you find something common in what is good at the financial numbers, and the word capital is common between the financial word, or he's aware of that word, and you're framing up, I don't know, we call a common word. Saying I like the word interpersonal capital. So capital world is comfortable with, and interpersonal capital he needs to work on.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. I think he would at least start thinking on how he's spending on the interpersonal capital.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah. And instead of getting systemic and thinking big picture, we're trimming off complexity and saying, how can you have this one exchange where that person has a good experience of the information and data that you're giving them?
Okay.
Yeah.
So if I may ask a question, yeah, I am attempting to link it to the 3 propositions you shared in the beginning. So if you want me to kind of like help me understand this, whatever process you follow to arrive at that word interpersonal capital, how do you link that to those 3 propositions you shared in the beginning?
Well, so we're working in this complexity side of the street.
Okay.
Like we need to build more complex interpersonal skills. And if we're going to build interpersonal skills, he has to value it, and he has to understand the value first. And so that's all I'm trying to do, is just to get that listening and where his mind tends to go, just to start to look at the interpersonal relationship. Because right now it's just a transaction of data, and that's my job, is just to give the data. But the way that he's doing it is going to cost him his job, or at least that's the potential.
Yeah.
And the organization likely needs his incredible acumen and skill from a finance perspective, but we've got to get that skill into relationships that feel good and that help people take in the data and put it into motion. So yeah, it's your job to kind of give really good information in terms of how the company is performing. But like, if you're delivering it in such a way where people don't want to hear you or don't want to be in relationship with you, they're going to be less likely to come get more information from you.
Interesting. Yeah.
Right? That probably hinders things. And so some of that kind of big picture thinking is needed to get him to start to value this very small exchange. But that's what we want to do, is the building block is, what are the things that you can do that give people a good experience? And I would say, you know, like this would be where your interpersonal gifts, like how do you build relationship, bring him into your mastery, into some of your competence, so that he can really learn from you. But it can be very simple things like, all right, instead of just coming in with numbers, you know, the first thing you're going to do is just ask, how was your day?
Yeah.
And how are you doing?
Uh-huh.
You know, like, if once you've checked those two boxes, now you can talk numbers.
Yeah. Interesting.
And then before you end the meeting, this exchange, ask, what would be more helpful?
Yeah.
Or can I provide anything? Like, just very simple things. And then over time, we can start to kind of build on those.
Yeah. Excellent.
Yeah. So
Thank
this
you.
idea, thank you. And we should move. But what I really want to make sure that people understand, in terms of levels of complexity, think creatively, because the human being is massively dynamic and creative. And so how we take care of relationships is ingenious. How we take care of companies is like so diverse. And so there's so many different growth pathways that are possible. It's near infinite. And so like your own lived experience, and then the imagination that you have with your client of what can you envision them doing. Like I mean, I haven't met this person, but I start to imagine like, all right, well, what are those two very simple things that they can do to begin a meeting so that they have a different emotional experience, you know, before I just give numbers, you know? So, but this idea of stripping things down to like, what are the basic building blocks that enable more complex skills to be built? So that's the seed that we're planting there. And because we've covered complexity now, and we'll weave it in as well as we move forward. So let me, unless there's any burning questions on complexity, let me pause here and see if there's something, and then I'll move on.
There's a question from Ashok Rob about the cultural boundaries that hold back differences. It's in the chat box.
Okay.
You may want to respond to that.
Sorry, I should read this out loud. So are there cultural boundaries that hold back differences in an apparently open conversation? For sure. Yeah. Huge differences in terms of what's welcomed. And so you're right to be asking that question. And based on that constellation of cultures, if it's a kind of a diverse group, or if it is just a Japanese one, then, you know, we can kind of calibrate. And again, like if culture is always operating on us, as well as these three that we're talking about today, just in terms of inside of your own psyche, but we've got to calibrate to cultural differences for sure. Let's see. So is this an example? Well, cultural differences might shift us more towards a learning kind of complexity thing. It might be shifting us towards a liberation piece. So it's a really good question. Culture is a different force altogether. At least I would treat it like that. And that what's happening in a particular culture is going to then impact these three factors that we're working with. Yeah. Ashok, thank you for that question. And is that useful, or do you have a follow-up? Useful. Okay, great. All right, so let's turn our attention to calling. And calling is at very simple. It's the reason or reasons for your existence. And it is the unique gifts that have been tethered into you, we might say. And so your movement towards greater purpose and a deeper or more meaningful life is what we're talking about when we talk about calling. So when you think calling, we can think of purpose and meaning, just at a very elemental level. What's a meaningful thing that we can do in this conversation, in this webinar? And we can also kind of expand it and start to say, well, what's happening right now that matters to you in the face of life and death, right? So what is the reasons for your existence? What is most moving to you? And so that's what we're getting at with regards to calling. One of the challenges that was brought forth was an optimism in the face of uncertainty. And we're obviously operating in very uncertain times. I won't explicate that too much, but there's a lot of uncertainty in many of our contexts in our world today. And so optimism in the face of uncertainty, we can, instead of let's think developmentally, how do we assemble more complex skills that provide optimism? I'm putting that on the sidelines right now, and I'm just thinking about meaning, I'm thinking about purpose, I'm thinking about calling. And optimism in the face of certainty, if we just invest in clarifying for your client, what are they really about? Regardless of what the world does, what is it that you're here to kind of learn and enact? Might be a powerful question. And if they can start to understand, get insight into what makes them unique, what makes them distinct, what is, we might say, special about them, what really enlivens them, what gets them excited, without any effort, where does their imagination and curiosity move? Those things have tremendous momentum to them. And they will, the more we put our attention inside of the things that are that we're made up by, there's an inherent kind of momentum, I think is the best word for it. And as soon as we get more and more confident inside, what is the value of where you innately go, your optimism is going to go up, particularly in the face of uncertainty, because I don't know what the world needs. I don't know what's going to happen. I'm not unsure, but I am really sure about where I tend to go and the inherent value that can create for the communities that I'm in relationship with. And so questions like optimism in the face of uncertainty are a great example of let's let's dive into your calling. Let's go in. And calling is I'll say one more thing about it just to kind of bring some nuance here. But with complexity, we're talking about building more complex skills. And with calling, we're talking about getting more intimately into that which matters most to you. Which means instead of expanding perspectives, and we see this in terms of, when you're young and you're wondering, what am I going to do with my life? You might say, oh, I might become this, I might become that, I might, like there's this broad kind of, I could go this direction or that direction. But over time, we make decisions, and that those decisions narrow where we're going. It doesn't mean that we can't have huge career changes and all that stuff, but there is something to be said about calling involves courage to participate with what matters most to you right now. And that's not taking more perspectives. It's actually investing in less differences. It's like I'm not choosing both things, I'm choosing one. And I have to kind of make some sacrifices to deepen my intimacy with what I'm really choosing. And so that's some of the maturation process, is like a bunch of possibilities, and we're whittling ourselves down into like this core constellation of gifts that we're really here to give. So that's calling in a nutshell. Let's dive in with Renu, and would you bring us into your context, and then we'll play a little bit here, and then I'll open it up for questions on calling.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi. Yeah. So I had posted my challenge to you on the mail, and should I read it out? I'm in the process of setting up my coaching practice as a transformation and a wellness coach.
Yeah.
And we are in the atrocities of COVID-19. And the need of the hour is, I sense that these two things are not the top priority for most of the clients, because there are other challenges that surpass wellness and transformation agenda.
Yeah.
Though I'm very, very close to my calling, and I'm not distracted by multiple directions. I'm very, very focused, but still I don't find myself enough to deal with this challenge I'm in now.
Say that last part again.
Yeah, though I'm very focused and I know what my calling is, I'm very, very connected to my life purpose as I state this problem to you, but still I don't feel enough to deal with it in here and now.
Yeah. So this is like, thank you for sharing. And I think we can all relate to the challenges of growing coaching practices. And the fact that you're kind of hugging your calling, you're closely moving with it, is really, really important. And the only thing, and so now I'm going to start to weave in calling, because you've done some good work there. And now we can kind of weave in complexity. And so you're already starting to do it. You're looking at the world, you're looking at the kind of post-COVID contexts, and you're also looking at your calling as it pertains to being a transformational and wellness coach. And like, it's that going back and forth between kind of listening to what is the world presenting, and then what are you really called to bring, and listening to what are the people and context around you struggling with, and again, what is your calling. And this going back and forth is what creates the neurological density where we become a more complex human being, such that it's going to become more and more evident why transformation and wellness is required or needed as a fundamental thing, not as a nice to have thing, but as a fundamental thing that people need. And that's kind of what we're going for, is this insight into what is this post-COVID world, and how is your calling needed, not as a nice to have thing, but as a fundamental. So let me pause and see what that stimulates in you, Renu.
As I hear you out, I'm quite frozen.
Frozen?
Yep.
Okay. And is it a loss of contact with your calling, or is it more like, I don't know what
I don't know.
is?
I don't know.
So it's kind of this inquiry into the world that is uncertain.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah. And let's come back to just your calling. What's most enlivening about transformation and wellness for you? Let's just put down the world and bring me back into the, like, your life force, your energy, your passion around transformation and wellness.
Both these words make me come alive.
Both of them do?
Yes. I'm a yoga teacher also, and I had been into a decade-long practice. So it's an integral part of my life, and wellness is very important to me.
Yeah.
And so is the transformational journey that I'm living right now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I would look at, what is your intimate response to COVID, and how has your yogic practice been fundamental? How has your wellness practices, how has the transformation that you're kind of, sounds like you're like right in it right now, like how's that helped you as it pertains to this COVID context that you're in?
It has helped me tremendously. It has kept me grounded, controlled, and managed my work and family with much ease. And my meditation practice, that had been a big respite during these difficult times.
Yeah. Okay. And so it's interesting just listening to you, that when you peer into what are you living, there's this groundedness, there's a greater control, there's a respite from the challenges. And I would say, like, who in the world is looking for ways to ground themselves, to have more control over their experience, and this ability to have a respite from the challenges that they're facing in COVID.
The world at large.
Yeah. So this is like your calling. If we listen closely to how you're being shaped by your own kind of movement, you get lit up and excited about wellness and transformation and how it's moving you. If we just look, like, you've already answered the question. There's probably very few people in the world that would say, no, I'm so grounded, I'm good.
Yeah.
Or I'm interested in how to invoke more control over myself and my experience, or how do I give myself more distance and space, this respite, to use your language, that provides rest and recovery in the face of like incredible stressors, you know? So this is like, you know, if you're to grow your coaching practice, like, these are some of the things that we could start to anchor around. And if you and I were to coach, like, I would be honing in on, okay, like, what are the ways that you ground? What are the ways that you invoke control? What are the ways that you create respite? And maybe there's other things that are happening that are incredibly valuable for you that you know, like you're living them, and you're ripe to invite people into your kind of practice and your kind of expertise and competence. But let's, like, how do you get out there? And it would be about talking about feeling groundless, you know, feeling out of control, feeling overwhelmed, you know, like for you to lead with those things, like most, you know, tons of the, you know, the human, our human ecosystem and communities are like grappling really hard with those. And for you to kind of reach out and say, you know, if you're feeling these ways, I am like living into transformation and wellness practices that can be really helpful for you.
Wow.
Yeah, go ahead.
I want to acknowledge that, and thank you so much. It makes sense.
Okay. Thanks for bringing us into your life. I really appreciate it. And for sharing generously. And just to say, so this was a great example where Ranu, and correct me if I'm mispronouncing your name, and I deeply apologize if I am.
No. You are telling my name right.
Okay, thank you. So Ranu's done really great deep work and trusting her aliveness and her calling, and so there's we could continue to go further in terms of clarifying that calling, and that could be some really generative work. It didn't feel relevant for me when I presenced the world, that kind of frozen quality emerged. And so when I was going back and forth between these two skills, and remember in the reading, there's like listening and there's expressing, and listening and expressing, and then, you know, over time they come together. And so that's what I'm trying to do here, is like listening to self, listening to world, listening to self, listening to world. What's the self expressing? What can the express? Let me articulate that more specifically. What is the self doing and expressing for myself? What is the self expressing and doing for other? You know, and this kind of going back and forth, as we started, some new connections started to happen, and I think like now this is how calling and development can work together. You know, because we just assembled some skills that weren't as ready, and now they are. You know, and hopefully, Renu, good luck, and we're all rooting for you. and maybe some people will reach out to you because they need you. So we could go on, but hopefully you're seeing a little bit more about what I mean by calling and how it relates to development. So we're starting to kind of do some complex things. And with that said, let me pause and just see, we've got about half an hour, but what questions are really alive? What inquiries are right on the tip of your tongue, so to speak? And let's open it up to some questions before we move forward. So I want to make sure that we understand this kind of basic thing.
I think, Rob, all I can say is I think people are completely spellbound listening to you.
All right. Well, we can keep going. And let me, I could define calling once more? Yeah. So this is kind of the, at the heart of calling is the reasons for your existence. That's like right at the center of what calling is. It's for Rob to glean in some sense what he was born and meant to enact. And the things that we're really called for, they matter most in the face of our death. And so one of the ways that I work with calling rigorously is to invoke, like, in, you know, when you die, does this matter? How would you find out without dying? The imagination is a powerful thing. And also death is vastly more ingenious than we are. You know, when our parents die, we die. When a close friend dies, a part of us dies. When we lose a job that we love, some part of us dies. And so death is everywhere. The world is dying. The pre-COVID world is gone. And we might be trying to kind of resurrect it, but it appears to be either passing away or already passing away. And that our sense of self and identity, to Ranu's calling, is in a grieving process and is wanting things to be back the way that they were, but they're not that way anymore. And so like this, like death is already here. And there's obviously kind of, to imagine what matters most to us in our ends is an incredible, powerful way for us to just glean insight into our purpose, our meaning, which again is kind of what has the most meaning for you, what has the greatest significance for you. All these things are getting at calling, but at the heart, it's kind of the purpose, you know, the reasons for your existence. But we don't always have to go to that deep. Some of our clients aren't ready. And so we can just say, what is the ultimate purpose of this meeting that you're preparing for? You know, that also, like, and what are you most called to do in that meeting? Super powerful. Like, oh, I feel really clear in what would be most valuable for me. And I think for the people that I'm with is if I can do this, you know, okay, like now we're working on calling in a much more accessible way, but it's not as durable. And so wherever your clients are at, you can start, you know, small, like what's, you know, this upcoming job interview? What's this upcoming challenge? Yeah. So how do you know what your calling is? And how do we let clients know their calling? Yeah. So your calling is going to be dictated by your own kind of confrontations with life and death. And calling is one of those things that it's, and I'll share just briefly with some of my own life. Just to give you an example. So my name is Robert, and Robert literally translates as bright counselor. And my father is a Lutheran pastor, and I shadowed him in middle school, and I was totally bored the whole day until a woman came to see him. And I remember my father and this woman walking into the church, into the actual worship part of the church. And my dad said, "I'll just sit in the back." And he and my he and this woman walked up and sat like kind of 3 or 4 rows from the front of the church. And they sat down next to each other and they faced the altar, and they were just in some intimate conversation. And I couldn't hear anything. I couldn't see anything. But when I was sitting back there looking at my father talking with this woman facing the altar, I was just like, I want to do that. I had no idea. And it just had me. Like for whatever reason, like that had me. Like to be in intimate conversation, facing the things that have the greatest significance, like it just mobilized my aliveness. Now, that was like a fleeting thing in my in that day, because I think we were, doing the church service bulletins, like after that, and I was bored again, and but I was probably in my mid-20s when my sister was like, what your name means, Rob? And I was like, no, what does it mean? And like, Robert means bright counselor. And at the time I was training to become a counselor. And I was like, oh, and so there's a way that the things that have us are really obvious, or at least they can be. And that it takes us the longest time to realize the things that are most obvious because they're always present. Like in high school, all of my close friends were talking to me about their most intimate challenges. And I was like the happiest when I was connecting with my friends like that. Same thing in college. It was like people were like, I need to have a McNamara conversation. And I didn't know what I was doing. I was just having really sincere conversations with people. And of course, now I've been coaching for many decades. So just to share a little bit of like, how do we recognize our calling? We have to be curious about what's most obvious. Because that can be the hardest thing to kind of find. And at least that was kind of my experience. And the more I recognize, like, okay, like I love that image of my father sitting next to this woman facing like the altar, what is most significant, and dealing with really tough challenges in that context is like, that's what I'm meant to do. And for me, in terms of my own grappling with death, that's what matters most for me. That's what matters most for me. So helping others, your own kind of living embodiment is an important thing to invite your clients into. And the clearer your kind of vehicle is around your meaning and purpose and significance, you can actually invite people into what's yours, and not in the sense that they need to do the same thing, but just as an example, this is what a human being feels like when they're plugged into or rooted into their kind of basic aliveness and their most significant meaning. And then to give them questions. This is an inquiry-based model. Like, what matters to you? When you were holding your mother's hand when she was dying, what mattered to you? When you lost your job, what mattered to you? It was the loss of my colleagues. So relationships mattered more than the outcomes. Yes, that's important to note. Like, hold on to that. Relationships matter to you. Can you still nurture those relationships that are most valuable even though you don't have the job? Oh, I could. You probably should. Things like that. If it's not obvious to clients, and none of this is obvious, and occasionally, like Ranu is a great example of, like, occasionally just stumble into people who are really clear. But a lot of us are not. And it has a lot to do with the contextual surrounds of an educational ecosystem and a cultural ecosystem that devalues the uniqueness, and certainly education in the West has been profoundly biased towards, can we just make people interchangeable? And which, has its ups and downs, but part of the down side of that is that we're educating people out of their uniqueness, and they actually don't have the roots that we're talking about. So a lot of people need these roots. And if it's not obvious, I use death. That's my go-to, is like, you can't know, like I can't know your calling without asking you. Just can't, like, only you know what comes up as most significance between you and your death. Like, that's something that is privately belongs to you, and that, like, what is your courage to kind of go in there and find what matters and then to bring it out. And it is an act of courage, because to touch the things that are most significant for us is to touch the things that are going to hurt the most, that are going to be the most devastating when we lose them. And so calling is this very intricate and complex thing of, like, the courage of the heart to touch what is most valuable, knowing that in the end it's going to be taken from us, or at least that'd be one perspective of death. So we could, all of these topics we could spend years on. So painting with just broad strokes, I want to keep moving just so that we have time for liberation. But yeah, go ahead.
Bob, just wanted to know, could calling be defined as a manifestation of a well-meaning intent? I think the earlier participant, Ranu, was talking about communicating about wellness. So is it really a well-meaning intent that needs to be carried through? Thank you.
That's a great way that we can think about it. Yeah, and I would say, like, it's the intent that matters most to you. Like, that's the calling part. And it's not so much, like, calling isn't so much what other people need. That's important too, but calling, the heart of it is, like, it is a private inquiry into your own kind of being. Like, what were you meant to enact? And what intentions, what well intentions, like, bring you into that motion, put those actions into motion. So that's a great reframe, and think creatively, because I'm just kind of throwing calling out there as one way that we can think about it, but yeah, be creative with it. All right, let's, if it's all right, let's transition just to liberation. And so liberation or freedom. And there's a few different kinds of freedom that I think are always moving. And the first is freedom of movement. And I think just before we began, I know some of you in Mumbai and other places are still in lockdown. And so freedom of movement has been restricted tremendously. And just to note that freedom of movement is always present. Like, this desire to just move. It appears to be ever present. So movement's one of them. Choice is the second one. So a freedom of choice. And you can choose to take what Rob's saying in this moment about liberation, and you can say, he's off. Or you might choose and say, oh, there's something here that could be of great value. But that's your free choice. It's like right here, how you're listening to me right now is a choice. Or how you're not listening is a choice. So there's tremendous freedom inside of our particular choices in any given moment. And it appears that we want more and more freedom of choice. And the third kind of freedom is just the freedom to have experiences. And this is a rabbit hole, but I wanted to share it anyways. But like, experience is vast and diverse and always changing, because like liberation is so abundant. And like, things keep changing, right? And so there's an inherent freedom in experience. So in the face of quarantines, in the face of varying degrees of lockdown, when we grapple with liberation, because you're not given the same kind of pre-COVID ranges of movement, you can go into your own movements inside of you, right? Instead of leaving the apartment, you can go on trips, go on journeys, go on imaginative expeditions without leaving your living room. Dim the lights, lay down, close your eyes, and go. Like, so there's ways that our freedom of movement can't be restrained no matter what's happened. I was teaching on Sri Aurobindo, like, I don't know, maybe a month ago. And part of his story of being incarcerated, and like, he's in jail, and yet he is visited and given like some exquisite yogic instruction. So he starts moving and starts experiencing whole new things, and he came out a transformed person, so that just as an example. But the human psyche right now is really grappling with restrictions of movement. And this is, to take physical movement away invokes interior movement. And so giving that to clients, because quite literally we need to move. Like, this is innate. We need to move, and we will, and similarly, I'm thinking of Ranu's yogic practice, so you can't leave your house, but you can move the body in incredible, diverse ways, and that prepare the body to not move, to take the seat of meditation and to be still. And we'll talk about that momentarily. But let me pause and just see if there's questions about liberation, and then let's see. I'm just seeing this. Unhappy about canceling their beach vacation on account of COVID. So they recreated a beach weekend at home with their beach clothes, a tub for the kids, and worked well to move them and still enjoy the experience indoors. Yeah, so this is the kind of stuff that you can't even dream up. Like, people's ingenuity and their creativity. Thanks for sharing that example. Yeah. So visualization is an incredible, powerful tool. Yeah. And we actually need to. We need to move. And let's see, reliving old memories. Yeah, it's a great way to actually, anything that leaves the here and now, and we have incredible range to go there, can be really helpful. And just to underscore the language here around reliving old memories, which is different than remembering. And to go back into a dream, to go back into an old experience, to go back into something and to relive it is to revivify it so that new things start happening in that situation, not just the remembering of the like your experience proper, but the creativity to kind of go back in. I was talking with one of my fellow monks who's in Brazil, and we've been commenting that our Brazil and the United States are not exactly managing COVID very well. And, but, I was like, how many times have you come down here to the Zendo here in Southern Utah? Like, the plane trip, the travel, the drive, the landscape, and you also know the Zendo. Like, so come and sit here. And she was grieving because usually in August we spend a good part of the month practicing here together, but we'll be doing it via Zoom. And she's just grieving it. And I'm like, well, yeah, let's grieve it. But also, you can totally come. In fact, you should come and travel here and walk into the Zendo and be here, in your own living room. And so those kinds of things are really important right now. So I want to give two, and I'm sorry, we're just running out of time, my friend. So I'm not going to be able to get to your vignette, and I apologize for that. But I want to kind of point at two different kinds of liberating experiences. And to do it, I'm just going to be brief. So bear with me. But just make contact with your seeking mind, the mind that's constantly seeking, and just feel the activity of searching and seeking and looking. What's next? And sleep is definitely an expression of liberation. And what's interesting is even in sleep, complexity is happening, and calling is happening in sleep too. But dreaming is hugely liberating, quite literally, you can go anywhere. And then in particular in sleep, deep dreamless sleep is the liberation from all things. At least that's one way that we can think about it. So back to seeking, just feel what it's like to seek. And one of the great things about seeking is that no matter what you find, you're on to the next thing. Like, well, what else? And so your seeking mind, your client's seeking mind, is a form of non-attachment. And non-attachment is a form of liberation. And so the fact that you're continually seeking with this part of your mind, no matter what you find, there's always well, what else? And that little movement to what's next? What else? Is this non-attachment to whatever you've already got. You've already kind of okay, I got that. Now what? The hand opens again and we start seeking for something else. And so that's one facet of liberation, is just whatever we're seeking, is non-attachment happening. We can feel it inside of the seeking quality that we heard about, just in terms of this incredible fiscal brilliance, and what is he seeking there? You know, like what's right there, and we might nurture that. You know, we could go like, well, what are you really after? What are you really yearning for? What are you really seeking for in this immensely pristine understanding of the numbers? Like, what do you know, like what's right there? And that's liberation happening. So that's one flavor. And then the other side, just to presence it in our last minute or two here, is the non-seeking mind. And just to give yourself a moment to just feel, what is it like to be non-seeking? And typically people will report a stillness, an expanse, a quality of relaxation, a surrender. And when we talk about being non-seeking, people will describe themselves as being beyond size, you know, infinitely big, unmoving. So this is another part of liberation that seems to always be here. And per our conversation around deep dreamless sleep, this appears to what we plunge into every night, and it's the most rejuvenating part of our sleep, is actually cascading into this this stillness, this emptiness. It's often described as. So let me let me volley it back to you in our last minute here, and I wish we had more time, but I really enjoyed being with all of you and surfing with some of this stuff, and I really hope that it's of service and it's of use to you and your clients and the many people that you touch. And then I meant to say thank you at the beginning for meeting me in English. So thanks, everybody. Yeah, over to you.
Wow, Rob, absolutely brilliant. I think so amazing. I'm taking in so many nuggets, the things that you so simply, articulated. Complexity, really reframing gifts of what you mentioned, that example of, the capital, conversational capital that you're spending to a person who understands finance. You talked about calling, which is courage to participate, what's important for you, right? And then last but not the least, you talked about the seeking and the non-seeking mind with regards to liberation. So I guess there's so much that you've said and so much that we've absorbed today. So thank you so much for this, Rob. It's words don't express our gratitude towards the lovely session that we've had today. I would, request all the participants to, I'm going to launch a feedback poll. It will take you just about not even a minute to answer that. So kindly do that. And as you're doing that, also mention your full name and your email ID in the chat box for you to get your CCEU certificates. So yeah, you could do that. Sorry, Abhilasha, can you launch the feedback poll, please? I, for some reason, am not able to do so. Abhilasha,
Yes,
are you
I'm
there?
just doing that.
Yeah, could you just launch it?
Just did that. In the meanwhile, Rob, there's a question. Do you suggest any book to be read on this?
Let's see. So a lot of this is unpublished. Just to name a good colleague, a good friend and colleague, Dr. Zach Stein. He's an exquisite human being. So check him out. And he and I have been in conversation for a couple years now on kind of this meta psychological framework. And I've been personally like doing a lot of reading into James Hillman, and his work around the soul is a great way of peering into this calling ecosystem. So that would be kind of one reading. Like Hillman is incredibly ingenious. For those of you familiar with, he was one of Jung's students, but this kind of archetypal psychology does get into calling in a way that other kind of psychological ecosystems can't. And so, maybe we get together and double click on some of this stuff. I'm more than happy to come again. This was a joy for me. But Hillman's a great.
So Rob, there's a request to you if you could write it in the chat box, the exact spelling of the book and the author that you've mentioned.
So the Soul's Code would be a good place to start, but all of Hillman's work is amazing.
So Abhilasha, have you been able to run the poll?
Yes, some folks are still to complete it. So if the rest of you could also just go and fill the poll, that'll be great. Just takes a few seconds.
So with that, thanks everyone for being here. Thanks, Rob. It was magnificent. We really loved the session and hope we can do a series to continue with such conversations. So thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. And thanks, Abhilasha, for being there, all the while.
Thank you, Anu.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Rob. Really insightful session. Loved it.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you all. Have a great evening ahead or whatever time that you are in. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Rob.
Thanks, Rob.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you, Rob. It's been a great session. Enjoyed it.